Welcome back. In this one, we're doing 13 cold cases finally solved. Let's go. On January 7, 1969, 23-year-old Jane Britton failed to show up for an exam. Her boyfriend, who went to her apartment to look for her, discovered her dead, blunt force trauma body. The boyfriend was ruled out, as was everyone else Jane knew, and the case went unsolved for years. Even after the advent of DNA testing in 1985, but investigators had preserved crime scene evidence. And a breakthrough arrived in 2012 when crime scene DNA was found to match that of a serial sexual predator and murderer who had been convicted way back in 1973. This mystery was finally solved thanks to forensic advances. Perhaps the same will happen for these other notorious cold cases. I don't know about you guys, but I can't even call this guy a person, not even a human. The DNA match for the serial sexual predator murderer was none other than Michael Sumner. He deserves to be in jail for the rest of his life. In December 1977, the body of a 16-year-old teen, Sharon Schomeyer, was discovered by her mom, strangled to death in 6 inches of water in the bathtub in her own apartment. With no suspects and only waterlogged evidence from which DNA extraction presents a challenge, investigators remain timid. In other words, stopped, confused, whatever, until 2013. The advent of the MVAC, which helps pull DNA from waterlogged material, made it very clear who killed Sharon. The same building manager at Sharon's apartment, who had let Sharon's mom into the building more than 30 years earlier. In 1995, the body of a 17-year-old was discovered along the Provo River in Utah, her skull crushed. Since the murder weapon appeared to be a rock, and extracting DNA evidence from rocks was almost impossible at the time, the investigation went nowhere. But in 2013, MVAC came to the rescue again, this time allowing DNA to be extracted from the surface of a piece of granite. The DNA from the cold case matched that of a local airport shuttle bus driver who at the time was recently released from a prison after serving a sentence in 1987 murder conviction. The 2-time murderer, Joseph Michael Simpson, is back behind bars where he'll remain for the rest of his natural-born life. In April 1981, The body of a young woman was found in a ditch along an Ohio highway. She had no identification, and no one came forward looking for a missing woman matching her description. Eventually, Buckskin Girl, as she came to be known because she was wearing a buckskin poncho, was buried, but not before investigators preserved the crime scene evidence, including extensive photos of the girl's face. Their work paid off, which the advent of forensic facial reconstruction, and in 2018, Buckskin Girl finally had a name. Marcia Lenore King. Unfortunately, there is no forensic evidence to date to find her killer. This next story, number 5. All right. There's no introduction for this killer. None at all. Because once I mention the name, you're going to know it. You're going to know it. So anyways, this is about an 8-year-old girl, April Tinsley, that was abducted. All right? Abducted, raped, and killed. Let's get into it. In 1988, when an 8-year-old April Tinsley was abducted and murdered in Indiana, DNA testing was fairly routine, but its utility was limited because of the database being so small. For 30 years, her case went unsolved, even as the killer taunted authorities with anonymous handwritten notes. The note went on to say, "Hi, honey. I've been watching you. I'm the same person that killed and raped and kidnapped April Tinsley." The message said, "You are my next victim," instead of victim. Okay, by 2018, the DNA database had grown to include not just convicted criminals, but also regular folks interested in tracing their ancestry, their ancestors. And sure enough, the DNA from those notes matched that of 2 brothers on the public genealogy site, one of whom ended up confessing to the crime. Now, the one that confessed, believe it or not, is John D. Miller. He's a convicted murderer and child molester. He's also known to be the Golden State Killer. In 1981, 24-year-old Nova Welsh was strangled to death in Birmingham, England. Her body was found 3 weeks later, stuffed in a cupboard that was sealed shut with a piece of chewing gum. The crime went unsolved for 36 years when DNA extracted from the chewing gum was found to match that of Nova's former boyfriend, Osmond Bell. He claimed he'd used chewing gum quite innocently as a simple home repair, unrelated to Nova's death. But the DNA also matched that on an envelope containing an anonymous letter pointing the finger at someone else for the murder, which is itself a known forensic countermeasure. In 2009, Sierra Bozagard was found murdered in Moss Bluff, Louisiana. But the case quickly went cold because the DNA evidence didn't match anyone in their database. Then, in 2015, using relatively new technology called DNA phenotyping, the DNA evidence was used to simulate what the killer would have looked like. Soon after, the sketch of a white male was recognized and the killer brought to justice. Some days, advances in forensic science may make unsolved cases a thing of the past. In 1999, when Mary Ann Vatsra was found murdered, police had lots of suspects. But even with DNA testing, the case remained unsolved. For the simple reason the DNA traces found on Mary Ann's body failed to match anyone whose DNA happened to be in the system. Then, in 2012, police took another look at the cold case and decided to ask all the men who lived within 5 miles of the crime scene to submit their DNA. Turned out the killer was a middle-aged neighbor who'd willingly submitted DNA when asked, putting him just about par with the world's dumbest criminals. On Christmas Eve 2001, Kevin Butler was stabbed to death during a break-in at his Dallas apartment. Also stabbed to death during the event was Butler's cockatoo named Bird. Investigators found human DNA in the bird's beak and on his claws. And it matched an acquaintance of Butler who turned out to have a financial beef with Butler. The man had wounds consistent with having been pecked and clawed by the cockatoo. The 2001 murder of 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan, who was discovered buried in a shallow grave in West Yorkshire, England, might have never been solved if it weren't for strands of dog hair that forensics team found on her body. Turned out the DNA in the dog hair matched the DNA of a dog owned by a man known to hunt the woods near the crime scene. It was the first time doggy DNA was ever used in Britain to identify a murderer. In 1994, Shirley Duguay went missing from her Prince Edward Island home. While police suspected her ex-boyfriend, they couldn't find any way to connect him to Shirley's disappearance. But the investigation yielded a jacket and shoes, both stained in Shirley's blood. And inside the jacket lining were 20 white cat hairs. They looked like they may have belonged to the ex-boyfriend's white cat. And sure enough, a comparison of the cat's DNA and the cat hairs were a match. For 30 years, the 1987 rape and murder of a 21-year-old law student in Millen had gone unsolved, even though a confessional poem describing the scene of the murder in incriminating detail, a copy of which had been anonymously sent to the student's parents on the day of her funeral. The original had been discovered in the home of one of the victim's ex-classmates. This sort of circumstantial evidence would not be enough to convict the killer unless the handwriting could match to the accused. In 2016, that's precisely what happened when a handwriting analyst was able to connect the ex-classmate to the poem. In 1978, 3 women were found murdered at Florida State University. One of the women was found with bite marks on her buttocks, which investigators said were distinctive in that the biter's teeth were not only crooked but chipped. A forensics expert testified at the trial that the bite marks matched the teeth of Ted Bundy, who police had suspected of several other murders in other states. Were the case to be tried today, such evidence would not be used. Bite mark impressions have led to wrongful convictions, and it's not considered reliable science. But back then, coupled with witnesses' testimony, it was enough to convince a jury. Today, investigators would be able to extract a DNA sample from the bite marks. Ted Bundy was, in fact, the killer in that case, as well as at least 29 other murderers. He was convicted as a serial murderer and executed in 1989. Hey everybody, welcome. Okay, you made it this far, you made it to the end. Don't forget to like and definitely subscribe. That's really going to help out the channel, alright? So like, share, subscribe, and you'll get another video when I bring another one out, which will be shortly. So yeah, definitely I'm going to be bringing out more, and there's your 13 mysteriously solved cold cases. See you again.